many of you probably know, I'm Susan Hoffman, the director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UC Berkeley. And I'm really delighted to have the author Isidra Mencos, who is here with us today, not only to talk about this incredible book she's written called Promenade of Desire, but she's going to give you a context from which she's lived her life and which has parallels in many places. And you will hear from her own turning points that were based not only on what was happening with herself, her body, her life, but also how it responded to the political circumstances. So, have any of you read Elena Ferrante around Naples? Okay, keep Ferrante in mind as you hear Isidra talk about Barcelona. She's talking about the 1960s, but we have a wonderful, I think, parallel. A few words about Isidra. She was born and raised in Barcelona. You will hear today about her adventures and the importance that books and dancing played in her life, as well as the cultural and political context. In 1992, she moved to the United States and earned a PhD from UC Berkeley. And there she taught for 12 years in the Spanish and Latin American studies program, in literature, in film. And some of you might remember that she also taught here at Ali at Berkeley. I believe it was even at the library, or it was,
yeah, we did it here and in Berkeley.
Yeah, did it both places. It was such a successful course on Goya, which was roughly about 5 years ago. So she taught for many years then at Berkeley, and then she has spent a fair amount of time continuing to write. She's been an editor. I think we're really delighted she's here with us today. Isidra.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, let me thank again Susan Hoffman and Oli for sponsoring this event. And thank you to all of you for being here at the Lafayette Library with me today. I'm delighted that you came to hear about this topic. Now, I think all of you have heard the sentence that the personal is political. But today I want to give it a little bit of a turn and say that actually the political becomes personal, want it or not. We see this today in the United States with the political polarization. Even if you don't want to participate and you want to be above the fray, you can't, because it determines even personal relationships. So many people have had relationships break down due to this polarization. So there's no way to escape your context. The context is part of us. That's even more important when you live under an authoritarian regime. It doesn't matter if it's from the left or from the right. An authoritarian regime is gonna intrude into every single corner of your life. And that happened in Spain, where we lived under a dictatorship for almost 40 years. So it's been said many times that Spain is actually two Spains, because we've had this polarization for a very long time. On the one hand, we've had the polarization between conservative and liberals, which started in the 18th century approximately, when that immutable order, God, king, aristocracy and clergy, and the populace was shaken as the bourgeoisie started to ascend, and then with money you could buy status. That was very upsetting, right, for certain parts of the society. So there was a big tension already from the 18th century between conservatives and liberals in Spain, and also a tension between the center of Spain, Castile, Madrid, and the periphery, Catalonia, Basque Country, etc., etc. The political situation in Spain with this polarization was so difficult, there was so much upheaval that we had 25 coup d'etat, either from the left or from the right, in about 100 years. And this polarization culminated with the Civil War that started in 1936 when General Francisco Franco led a coup d'etat to take away the legally elected government, which was the Second Republic. Now, when we talk about Republicans in Spain, we don't mean conservative. Republicans are those from the left that were against the monarchy. Okay, so that's what Republicans means in Spain. It's not conservatives like here, right? So Franco led what he called nationalist forces and led this coup d'etat, and he had two allies in Europe, and the allies were Mussolini and Hitler because he had a fascist ideology. In fact, this photo that you see here of the destroyed town, that's a photo of Guernica. Guernica you may have heard about from Picasso's very famous painting, the Cubist painting Guernica. Well, it refers to this. It refers to the bombardment and complete destruction of this town in the Basque country, Guernica, which was executed actually by the German Legion Condor, the air force from Hitler, right? So that's how this town was destroyed. The Civil War had a tremendous effect on the population of Spain in terms of losing a lot of population. Over 500,000 people died in the war. And demography researchers have concluded that about 500,000 more people actually were not born, either because so many men died during the war or because after the war many more men also died or went to exile, etc. So huge depopulation issue. Here you see, just for illustration, a photo of Franco troops entering Madrid, and then in the left, I think that's the New York Times actually, Mussolini and Hitler rejoice with Franco's victories. So the Francoist dictatorship lasted almost 40 years, okay? And the lema, or the leitmotiv, was España es una, grande y libre, one, grand, and free. Of course, that couldn't be farther from the truth, right? Because first of all, one, what did that mean? Well, Franco really wanted to privilege the center, Castile, all being really ruled from Madrid, right? While Spain had a lot of diversity in many ways. We'll talk more about that. So it wasn't really one, but he called it one. It wasn't free, obviously, because it was a dictatorship. All the political parties were banned, except one, the Falange, which was a fascist party. So it was very far from free, but that was how he qualified Spain. And then grand, okay, these illusions of grandeur that always go with a dictatorship of any kind. I'm talking about any political party. Okay, wait, did I jump one? Oops, I think I might be going, yeah, there we are. Okay, so as soon as the war ended, and let me preface this by saying, of course, during the war, both sides, Republicans and nationalists, committed atrocities, because that's what happens in war. But Franco's forces won the war. So from then on, it was really the Francoist regime that became extremely repressive of anybody who either had been Republican or was suspected to be allied with the Republicans, right? So you can see here some figures over, first of all, the 1939, he had the political responsibility law. What that meant is that by law, anybody who had been associated with the Republicans could have all their assets seized. And there was an incredible amount of that happening, as well as a lot of repression. Over 400,000 people were in prison. Over 150,000 people were executed by the Franco regime that were either Republicans or sympathizing with Republicans. There were also 2,000 mass graves. You see in the photo a mass grave that was discovered in 1977. Even today, they are discovering mass graves. But what's happening, and you may have seen the latest movie from Pedro Almodóvar, Parallel Mothers. So one line of that plot is precisely about one of the protagonists, who is Penélope Cruz, the actress, fighting to be able to disinter her ancestors that were buried in a mass grave by the Francoist regime. There were also around 50,000, between 50,000 and 300,000, the real numbers are not known, but that's what's calculated, of stolen babies. Babies that women that were poor, Republican, etc., would have in the hospital. At that time, they would put the mother to sleep to have the baby. When she woke up, they told her the baby had been born dead, or that had died shortly after the death, and then they gave those babies to good nationalist Catholic families to raise, something that also happened in Argentina, and it has happened in many authoritarian regimes. So I'm going to recommend to you a documentary that is in Netflix. You can see it. It won an Oscar. It's called The Silence of Others. And this documentary follows a group of plaintiffs as they have started a lawsuit against people from the Franco regime, associated with the Franco regime, who executed or tortured their ancestors. But here is the wrinkle to that. In Spain, when democracy came about in 1977, there was a law of political amnesty passed. That law pardoned all the political prisoners that Franco still had in jails, but it also pardoned anybody related to the Franco regime who had committed any crimes during the dictatorship. So these plaintiffs in the documentary, they cannot pursue those culprits in Spain legally because they are pardoned by the law, that law from 1977. So they actually have to appoint a judge in Argentina and prosecute them under international law. So that's the journey that is explained in the documentary, The Silence of Others, which I very highly recommend. The first years after the war were very difficult, as it would be in any country after the war. They are called the years of hunger in Spain. And it's more or less, there's no, of course, precise number, but some historians have said that about 200,000 people died either from hunger or illnesses related to hunger. It was also a very difficult time because Spain was completely isolated from the outside world. Aside from the devastation that any war creates in a country, there was this political and financial, economical isolation because, of course, World War II started, Hitler and Mussolini lost, and Franco was left without any allies. And then all the other countries didn't want to recognize his regime, which had been installed through a coup d'etat. On the other hand, Franco also was positioning his economy to be protectionist and trying to be self-sufficient in Spain and not have anything to do with the rest of the world. That had terrible consequences. The economy completely tanked in the 40s, and that's part of the reason that there was the years of hunger. Now, I talked before about the depopulation. This is my family. I am the girl that is looking at the baby with the long hair. We were 10 siblings. So that's something that came about with the Franco regime. They had lost so many people in the war. The country was very depopulated. So Franco passed a law to support large families. I still remember my father coming home and saying, "Oh, we got the award for being a large family." It wasn't a lot of money, but it was a little bit of money to help families that were going to have a lot of kids. And it was very, very common. I mean, I had friends who had 14 siblings, 8 siblings, 9 siblings. We were 10. And of course, another reason that there were these large families is that it was a very Catholic regime, and contraception was completely forbidden, right? Because, first of all, they wanted to populate the country, but also because simply it wasn't allowed. No method of birth control was allowed. So very large families that were very much supported by the state. And if you read official documents from that era, they actually say that the family unit is the foundation of the nationalist regime that they are there to raise good Catholic nationalist kids. So it was really seen as a way to push up the regime as well. I was saying at the beginning of this presentation that an authoritarian regime really goes into every corner of your life, want it or not. One of the things that got repressed during the Franco regime was languages other than Spanish. Nowadays, Spain has 5 official languages. Who knew that? Did anybody know that? I see a couple hands there. Good, very good. Yes, it has the blue one, which is Galician, which is very similar to Portuguese. The green one is Basque, from the Basque country. The red one is Catalan, which is spoken in Barcelona, where I'm from. The little yellow one is Aranese, which is spoken in a tiny region which is between France and Spain. And then the rest, of course, is Spanish. Well, once Franco came into power, we talked about how he wanted to see Spain as one, no diversity, right? So one of the first things he did was to ban all the other languages. You couldn't learn them in school. You couldn't publish anything in those languages, not in the media, not books. You couldn't do movies in those languages. You couldn't even speak it in public, supposedly. Now, this very strict repression lasted only a few years. And then already around the 50s, you could start publishing in Catalan or other languages. However, they were not brought into the school curriculum until after Franco passed away. Okay? So I actually was 19 years old when for the first time, I could take a class and learn to write and learn the grammar of Catalan, a language that I had known how to speak since I was a child, because a lot of people in the little town where we spent the summer spoke only Catalan. You know, even though it was forbidden to speak in public, it's not like they went to every little town to see if somebody was speaking it and putting them in jail. You know, in the small towns that were very, very Catalan, Catalan continued to be spoken and spoken in the street. So although in my house we spoke Spanish, outside in the streets, you know, going to a store, talking to the clerk, I listened to Catalan all the time in the summertime, and then I learned it that way. But I couldn't study it in school until I was 19, and it finally came into the curriculum at the university. Nowadays, these languages are co-official in the region. If you go to Barcelona nowadays, you're going to hear Catalan everywhere on the street. You're going to see that all the signs are in Catalan. If you need to do anything legal, the documents are going to be in Catalan and Spanish. Spanish is official in the whole country, and then these languages are co-official in the regions. But let's talk about another side that was repressed during the Franco regime, and that was sex. Yes. You may think, like, how can you repress sex? Nobody knows what's happening in your bedroom. Well, no, yes, they repress sex very much. One of the ways they did that was through establishing an organism that was for censorship. And they censored every movie, every book, every magazine, anything that was going to be for public consumption was censored, okay? So I put here this photo of the movie Mogambo because something very funny happened, is that at the beginning of the Franco regime, it was forbidden to subtitle movies. Movies by law had to be dubbed. Why is that? Because the censors came and say, oh, cleavage, let's cut that scene. Oof, French kiss, out, we're gonna cut it. Then if you were cutting the movie, or, you know, maybe the images were not sexy, but the talk was sexy, you didn't want Spanish who understood English to understand what was being said. So dubbing allowed for manipulation. So in this example of Mogambo, what happened is they cut all the scenes that were sexual or sexy, and they made Clark Gable and Ava Gardner, that in the movie are lovers, they made them into brother and sister. Which, I have to say, it made for very weird, incestuous innuendos. It was like, oh, brother and sister, they're looking at each other with a weird way, but that's what happened, you know? So censorship was really, really big. And also, any public displays of sexual behavior could be punished with jail. That actually happened to me. Well, I didn't end up in jail, but I was threatened that I would be taken to jail. That's one of the scenes in my memoir. When I was with a boyfriend, I was 17, we were making out in a car in a deserted street at midnight, and all of a sudden, click, click, we hear something on the window, and it was 2 guards that were threatening us to take us to jail for kissing in public, you know? So it was just very, very repressive. And of course, you were taught that sex was only for marriage. Within marriage, it was for procreation. And let's not even talk about masturbation, because that was a sin that could take you straight to jail, right? But also, even sex in marriage, when you read things from the era, it was said, you know, women were not expected to have pleasure. That was just a duty that you performed to serve your husband. Women needed to be for the husband's pleasure, not for their own pleasure. Very repressive atmosphere. Now, women were second-class citizens during the Franco era. This is my family. My mom is the second from the right, and the other ones are my aunts, and the guy in the middle is my uncle who married my other aunt, who's not in the picture. And you can see them that they wear the mantilla and the peineta, that huge, beautiful filigree comb, and you know, the heads had to be covered in church, but they would make them pretty with that comb and that beautiful embroidered shawl, the mantilla. Anyway, so women came from the Second Republic, which was a leftist government. The Second Republic had been very progressive. It had allowed divorce, abortion, women could be part of Congress, et cetera, et cetera. Now, Franco comes in and all of that is scratched. Absolutely not. So, for example, women couldn't work after marriage unless their husbands gave them written permission. And even then, they could only work on certain jobs, not other jobs that were considered too manly for women, right? Also, divorce, contraception, abortion, all of that was banned. It became penalized. And adultery was penalized as well, but it was penalized very differently for women than for men. Women that were caught in a one-night stand with a lover could go to jail immediately, that they had committed a crime. Men who committed adultery were only considered criminals if they actually lived with the woman or brought the lover to their own house, you know, and live with their lover in their house or outside. But otherwise, it's okay. You know, you can echarte una cana al aire, as we say, you know, like throw gray hair into the air, and that's okay. Boys will be boys, right? Then also, women needed their husband's permission for anything legal. Opening a bank account, signing a contract, anything they wanted to do, their husband had to write their permission. And that was called el permiso marital, the marital or the spousal permit, we would say, you know, or license. So, I mean, I never got the sense that my mother was subservient or that she was, you know, a meek woman under the thumb of my dad. She was a very strong woman. But on the other hand, you know, she was a stay-at-home mom, so were all my aunts, except one of them who was a widow and was forced to start working. So they had their role very clearly assigned, and they were happy with the role. They were at peace with the role. But if they weren't, they would have had trouble finding other ways to do things unless their husbands gave them permission. Now, I have to say, this changed gradually during Francoism. And I think in Francoism, we can talk about 2 stages. The first stage of Francoism, which was the 40s and the beginning of the 50s, was very, very repressive. Now, at that point, Franco realizes, I can't continue going that way because the country is floundering, the economy is in shambles. I need to open up to other countries, and the other countries are not going to want anything to do with me if I continue being that very fascist, very repressive regime. So he started opening a little bit and, passing some laws that allow a little bit of less restriction and a little bit more opening. So that happened as well for women. For example, in 1958, which is the year I was born, finally, marital property could be shared, which means that until then, anything a woman had passed to be her husband's property. They could take jobs that previously were banned. Now they could do them, like being a judge or a notary, with their husband's permission. Also, fathers could not give their kids for adoption just suddenly like that without the mother's permission, which means that until 1970, they could do it if they separated. So little by little, but if you see until 1975, that's the year that Franco died, the marital permit or spousal permit was still the law. So it really took a long time to really become liberated. And I remember having friends that we would be talking about jobs and which jobs women could perform and so on and so forth. And I would say, women can do anything men do. We are just as intelligent. And they would say, no, what are you talking about? Women are not as intelligent as men. And we had those discussions around 1974, 1975. That's me at 6 years old in my first communion. And yeah, the Francoist regime was very closely allied to the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church pervaded everything. First of all, they were in charge of education. Second of all, the state was considered a Catholic state, so that was part of their constitution. And also, the church didn't pay any taxes, and the state paid for the church to live. So that's one of the things that surprised me when I came to the US. When I came to the US and I started going to church, I started receiving these envelopes at home that asked me for money. And I was like, why are they asking me for money? I couldn't understand it, but then it dawned on me, of course, in Spain, they never ask you for money because the state paid for everything for the church. So it was very, very closely allied. Now, every aspect of life was regimented by the church. The schools couldn't be co-ed because that was too dangerous to have boys and girls together. So I always went to a Catholic school run by nuns, only girls. Even baby names were coerced by the state. Of course, it was the law that you had to choose a baby name that was in the Bible, that was of a saint. That had been the law for many, many years. With the Franco regime, you couldn't even enroll your kid in school unless you showed a certificate of baptism. So he or she had to be baptized. And then what happened in the 50s is that all of a sudden there was a Pope's encyclical or discourse or writing that was about the Virgin. And maybe because of that, all of a sudden, the Spanish priests decided that every single girl in the country needed to have the name of a virgin or Maria in front of another different name. So, for example, the name of virgins, Mercedes, Asunción, all of those are different incarnations of the Virgin. So all the baby girls had to either have one of those names or Maria in front. So at home, we are 4 sisters, 6 brothers, 4 sisters. My older sister is Maria del Carmen. I am Maria Isidra, that's my official name. My sister is Maria de los Ángeles. And my younger sister escaped the Maria because she has a virgin's name, Mercedes. So actually, 9 out of the 10 most popular names for baby girls in Spain in the 60s had either Maria something or simply Maria. Can you imagine? It's like you went to school, and luckily in Spain we call the names the full name. Nobody called me Maria. Everybody called me Maria Isidra, because otherwise, all the girls in the class would have been Maria. So it's just, as I say, it really gets into every corner of your life, an authoritarian regime. This all started to change in 1962 with the Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council. I don't know if you've heard about the Second Vatican Council, but that was a council where those councils are when you actually start changing the doctrine of the church. And in that council, it was very progressive. Pope Paul VI, who was the one who guided and ended the council and had all the documents redacted, did things like, for example, that now Mass didn't need to be said in Latin, which had up until that point it needed to be in Latin. It could be said in Spanish or whatever. For example, all religions were considered equal and everybody was free to practice their own religion. Now this is a sea change for Spain, because Spain only allowed services for Christians, Catholics. So you could be Jewish, but inside your house. You couldn't go to the synagogue. It was forbidden. It was not allowed to have other public services of religious faith that were not Catholic. So this makes a huge change already in Spain, when all of a sudden the Pope is saying, no, all religions are equal and everybody is free to practice its own religion. Another thing that happened is that this Vatican Council talked a lot about the poor and really privileging the poor and helping the poor and equality among all. It was a very liberal council, and that made a huge impact in Spain in several orders of friars and priests that were starting already to feel really uncomfortable with the Franco regime, the fascist ideology, and started to align more with this more progressive view of Catholicism. One of them was my parents. My parents were very Catholic, very, very sincere Catholic, and they changed our Sunday Mass from the church that was in our neighborhood, which was very traditional, to the church of an order of friars that were very progressive, Los Capuchins. I'll talk about them a little bit later. And they actually started doing the Mass in Catalan, and they would be talking about the poor and equality and freedom and all of those things, which are very kind of quote-unquote revolutionary within an authoritarian regime. Another thing that happened in the 60s is that the economy finally rebounded. It was called the economic miracle. What happened there? Well, first of all, Franco started to open a little bit more to the rest of the countries and started trade. He also started providing enormous grants to industry. One of the industries that was more powerful was the automobile industry, and in particular, the brand Seat. This little car that you see here, El 600, the Seat 600, was the first affordable car that most middle-class, lower middle-class families could buy in Spain. Everybody had a 600. My mom drove a 600, for example. So for a series of reasons, there was a lot more industry, was protected by the state. There was a lot of migration from Spaniards into the rest of Europe, and they would send money home. And the other thing that happened is a huge explosion of tourism. That was a type of business that the government really supported. That's when the big amount of tourists started arriving to Spain. I have to say that that started the phenomenon of las suecas, the Swedish girls. That was, imagine all these Spanish men who can never find a Spanish woman that is going to have sex with them because it's a sin and they have to be married. And they are like going nuts. And all of a sudden, all these tourists come, all these beautiful girls from Sweden or Great Britain or wherever that are a lot more liberal. And the Spanish young men were crazy about their suecas, their Swedish girl, which were not all Swedish. But they would go like crazy into all the beaches trying to land one, The slogan that made Spain into a huge, powerful tourist attraction was, España es diferente. Spain is different. Playing out the differences in Spain from the rest of Europe, which was a lot more liberal, a lot more modern, a lot better off financially, as a plus. But when they did that, they also homogenized Spain and presented it to the world as the land of the sun, the flamenco, and the paellas, and the toros, the corridas, the bullfights. Which is not what Spain is, okay? Yes, we love our paella, yes, we do, but that's not the national dish of Spain. Spain is a very diverse country. Not only it has 5 official languages, but the landscape is really different. The foods are different. The folklore is different. Even the character is different of people from the south to the north, etc. So it is not such homogeneous country, but that's the image that was presented. Another sign of change, if you see here, this is the order of friars that I was talking about, the Capuchins that lived in a wealthy area of Barcelona. And what you're seeing in the right side is a photo of students that were reunited using the Church of the Capuchins to form an illegal student union, because all the unions were illegal, obviously. And the policemen laid siege to that church for 3 whole days, while the friars were protecting them inside the church and allowing to have their meetings. After 3 days, they came out, and of course, they arrested the leaders, etc. But I wanted to show that because this is the first photo you're seeing of a huge mass of people that are doing something against the regime. And that started becoming an uncontainable tide. More and more, as Spain was opening to other countries, people were migrating and knowing what was happening in other places. Tourists were coming here with their own points of view. People started, the dictatorship is too small, it's too oppressive, and there starts to be a really big movement of protest and dissent. And a big part of that was the students. You're gonna see from now on that we're gonna have several photos of big masses of people protesting. Another thing that started in this era was terrorist attacks, and that was really a terrible tragedy that happened in Spain for many years. The most well-known terrorist group is ETA, Euskadi Ta Akatasuna, which means Basque, Homeland, and Liberty, and it was a terrorist group, leftist terrorist group in the Basque country that said that we needed to end Francoism by force, violently, and that wanted the independence of the Basque country. So they started doing a lot of terrorist acts, and they actually killed 829 people since 1968 until 2010, and injured thousands more. So it was really a terrible thing. And then over time, you started to get also terrorism from right-wing groups and paramilitary groups that were trying to also hit ETA. It was a time of upheaval starting in the 60s. You could see that things were starting to boil and were starting to move in Spain. Franco was getting older, his health was failing, and he was trying to figure out how is this gonna continue my regime once I'm not here? So he decided to nominate Prince Juan Carlos de Bourbon as his successor, hoping that he would bring in an authoritarian monarchy. What he didn't know is that Juan Carlos, like his father before him, who was exiled in France, had liberal democratic tendencies. And in fact, during the beginning of the 70s, unbeknownst to Franco, Juan Carlos was meeting with the leaders of illegal political parties and plotting how to move the country towards democracy once he was at the helm. But Franco had no idea about that. 1974 was a crucial year for Spain because that year, La Junta Democrática, the Democratic Board, was formed officially in exile, and that was an organism that grouped together all the political parties that were illegal still in Spain. It was also the year of the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, a peaceful revolution to end their dictatorship, which gave a lot of hope to Spaniards. Now think about it. In Spain, we already have constant demonstrations at that time. People wanting democracy. There was the opposition or the illegal parties organizing in exile. Everybody was getting ready for change. At the time, 1974, I was in my last year before college. It was my prep college course. And I remember very well when Franco executed a Catalan anarchist called Salvador Puig Antich, who had participated. He was in one of these anarchist groups who also believed in violence, etc. And he had participated in a bank robbery, and in the process of the robbery, he had killed a policeman or a guard, a security guard. And so the Franco regime executed it, and I remember that very well. At home, we talked about all of those things. It was a moment of great upheaval politically. You could see that things were starting to change, so much so that even Franco nominated a prime minister that started what he called an apertura, the opening, right? And it was still very timid, but there were like the first efforts to look like we're going to be more democratic. But when this thing happened with the anarchists, I remember writing poems about this death, not because I agreed with what he did, but because I was against the death penalty. And it was just a topic of conversation in my house. Being Catholic, my parents also were against the death penalty, so it was something that we talked about. And as you can see, this is actually the New York Times, students, again, went into the street to riot and demonstrate against the execution of this anarchist. The day of November 20th of 1975 is a day we will never forget in Spain. That was the day that Franco died. It's known for everybody as El 20N, the 20th N. And everybody knows what El 20N is, because it was such a huge break or difference in Spain. Franco passed away. He passed away from being old and being sick. And pretty soon, Juan Carlos was then crowned king. And in the very first speech he did, I remember like it was yesterday, I was in a friend's house with a group of friends, and we watched that speech in TV, feeling very defeated that, oh, he's going to come and talk again about, the nationalist, Catholic Spain, blah, blah, blah. No, that speech, he paid homage to Franco because, he had been raised by Franco. And then after that, he started saying things like, Spain needs to be more similar to Europe, we are a plural country, and a series of things that led a lot of people that thought that he was going to be just a lackey following on Franco's footsteps, scratching their heads. What does he mean? What is he going to do? Well, what he did was actually facilitate a transition to democracy. And he did it by nominating Adolfo Suarez, is the guy in the middle that is signing a paper there, as prime minister. Now, Suarez was very young. He was in his 40s, which was already a big change for Spanish politics. And he had been part of the Franco regime, so he had been part of Congress for many years. So the people who were from the old guard respected him, and they thought that what he said, it was okay. He was a great diplomat, and he was able to join everybody in Las Cortes, which is the Congress and Senate together in Spain, and support what he called the law of a political, I'll come back to that. There. So he did a political law, now it escapes me the name of the law, but it was a law that allowed the legalization of political parties and started opening the door towards democracy. However, that transition into democracy was not happening fast enough for us, the youth. I was in my first year at college. I went to many demonstrations to protest, to ask for a quicker transition, to ask for the liberation of political prisoners. So it was, again, lots of upheaval, and not always as peaceful as it looked like, that transition. So he kicked off the real transition. And at the same time that this political transition was happening, it took a couple years to culminate into an election, the cultural and sexual revolution happened in a nanosecond. All of a sudden, we went from a country where you couldn't even French kiss in public to a country where all you could see were tits and butts everywhere. Every magazine, this magazine Interview came out in this era. Every single cover of the magazine had a naked actress or some breasts or something. All the TV programs had new hostesses, very well endowed with huge cleavages. All the movies in the second part of the 70s were full of nudity and sex and everything else. It's like the whole country went crazy. They call that el destape, which means either the uncovering or taking the lid off. Now that term, if you remember that we talked about censorship in movies, right? That term refers to the end of the censorship in movies. So that's when the censorship office was canceled, and that's why all these movies with lots of nudity could come about. But in fact, it kind of came to symbolize what happened to all of us in society. We pretty much went from being these very Catholic repressed beings to being completely crazy. It was like the hippie era came to Spain in a moment. At that time, I was at university. There was a commune that opened up in a house very close to mine, in an abandoned house. And I was there every day. You know, I was like communes, hippies. All of a sudden, like that, it happened very, very quickly. At the same time, we were continuing with this demonstration, trying to force the hand of the king and Adolfo Suarez to make democracy come about faster. This is a photo of one of the demonstrations that happened to me, where I almost got beat up by police, a scene that you will read in my memoir if you get it. Finally, they started legalizing the parties, they gave freedom of the press, and they also passed a law that was very consequential, which I talked about before. That is the political amnesty law. And that's the law that I was mentioning that pardoned all the political prisoners that were still in the Franco jails, and they could go out free, but they also pardoned every single person that had committed any crimes during the Franco regime. So the people that had tortured, that had stolen babies, that had whatever they did, they could not be prosecuted. And that was kind of sold to the country as, you know, we cannot linger in the past, you know, we need to forgive and forget and just start at a new page with a democratic regime. June 1977 was the first democratic election in Spain in 41 years. It was a thrilling moment that I remember very well. This photo that you see, that's a small little town in Toledo, and look at the line. I mean, these people hadn't been able to vote in 41 years. For some of the people like me, it was the first time ever voting. And let me tell you something. I have never, ever missed an election since. Not even the midterms here in the US. I vote in every single election, because once you have not been able to vote, you know how important that is. And the winner of the election was the party of Adolfo Suarez, the prime minister, which was a centrist party, Unión de Centro Democrático. But in second place came the Socialist Party, el Partido Socialista Obrero Español, or PSOE, which, imagine, coming from a fascist regime, and now we have, as the bigger opposition party, a socialist party. More rights were passed, the right to form unions, birth control was decriminalized finally in 1977. But let me tell you, it wasn't easy to get a birth control pill. Not easy at all, because you would go to the doctor and he would say, "Are you married?" "Well, no." "I cannot give it to you then." "But what do you mean? I mean, it's legal. Why cannot you give it to me?" "Oh, no, I'm not going to give it to you unless you're married." I had to promise that I was about to get married, or otherwise I wouldn't get the pill. That's just how it was still. So, I mean, even though the laws were passed, they were not necessarily applied with a happy face in every corner. 1978, we had a new constitution that was passed by majority in the Cortes, and it was defined Spain as a parliamentary democracy with equality, justice, and plurality. That term plurality is really important for Spain because we've talked several times about its diversity, right? So that opened the door to start creating the process of autonomic governments. So kind of similar what you have in the US, where you have the federal government and the state governments. Only in Spain it's not state governments, it's autonomy governments. So regions like Catalonia has its own government, Andalusia in the south, its own government, and so on and so forth. And again, we have, on the one side, the democracy journey, and on the other side, the cultural journey, right? And this cultural journey that had started with El Destape now has two main roads. One of those roads is what was called the disenchantment. Why is it the disenchantment? Because the youth, and I was part of that youth, had fought so hard for the last few years, especially all the students, right, for democracy. We had gone to so many demonstrations. We had really put our skin in the game, right? And then they go and they pass this amnesty law, and the Congress is still formed by the same people that was part of the Franco regime. So a lot of the youth kind of got disenchanted with the political process because they felt that we were not breaking enough from the Francoist regime and ideology. But also, frankly, we were tired. We were burnt out. And we now have freedom, and we wanted to enjoy it. So really, the philosophy of the youth was hedonism. Hedonism, 150%. And the movida madrileña, the Madrid scene or the Madrid movement, refers to this kind of hedonism where all of a sudden the youth was out every night until 5 a.m., 6 a.m., partying, having fun, experimenting with free love, with drugs, with music, with everything else. It was like an explosion of expression, of happiness, of pleasure, of all the things you couldn't have done. And the music that became like the top of the line in that moment in Spain was punk, because it was very rebellious. You had artists like Ukelele, a photographer, very famous photographer of the movida, which created this type of works that you see in the middle, very colorful, very kind of surrealistic. And then you had fashion designers like Agatha Ruiz de la Prada, who is there on the right-hand side, that would create this whole line of really fun, whimsical fashion that people adored because it expressed how we felt. It's like we had been boiling under the cover, and all of a sudden, phew, we went out and we were just anxious to have fun and be colorful and be rebellious and do everything we couldn't do before. That's the time also that the director, Pedro Almodóvar, comes into the scene. His first movie came out in 1980. I don't know if you've seen this movie, Pepi, Lucy, Bom y las chicas del montón. It's completely outrageous, very much in the line of what was happening there of let's have fun and let's be absurd, right? And so like, just to tell you briefly this plot, these Pepi, Lucy, Bom are three girls that are neighbors, they are friends. One of them is a punk singer, which is actually the same punk singer that you saw in the previous screen, Alaska, from Alaska y los Pegamoides. The other one is married to a policeman who beats her, and then they decide to rescue her, and in order to rescue her, they convince her to become a lesbian, and then they go to a club, and in the club there is a contest that is called General Erections, not General Elections, General Erections. So it's all about sex and fun and the absurd and so on and so forth. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's just to have a few laughs and say, we are outrageous because we can, okay? Now, this hedonism and pleasure and fun and absurd had a bit of a dark side as well, because one of the things that the Spaniards, the youth, experimented a lot with was drugs. And unfortunately, the drug that was most fashionable at the time was heroin. So in the 80s, there was a huge epidemic of heroin and AIDS as a consequence with infected needles. Oops, I'm gonna lose my thing. And also robberies to feed the addictions. I, in fact, had several friends who became addicted to heroin. I knew people who died from AIDS. And you know, people who really went into the dark side. I feel like when I think about my generation, I sometimes feel like we were a little bit lost because we were so drunk on this new freedom, but we didn't have role models for it. We didn't really know how to manage it. And a lot of people went so much into the other stream that they got a little bit lost. I had a few friends who killed themselves. And a couple of them were from that commune that I had been friends with, that I think at a certain point they realized the commune and their very idealistic philosophy was not going to work, and they kind of were left rudderless, no, where do we go now? We don't like the system, but we don't know where to go because what we tried in the counterculture didn't work, and so there were a lot of casualties. I didn't go to that extreme, but I definitely did a lot of experimentation in my youth. It was just in the atmosphere.
3 more minutes.
Okay. Oops. Okay. This is me at 15, Catholic Virgin Maiden, and this is me at 23, seductive Mata Hari. That is a little bit the journey that we did as Spanish women that had grown under the dictatorship and then went into the freedom and the excess of the post-Francoist era, a journey that I talked about in my memoir. And for me, the door that opened to freedom was dancing salsa, which I absolutely loved. There was only one club in Barcelona called Tabú in the red light district that had salsa, and that's where I went every evening. Now, as I said, it wasn't as free and as peaceful as you think. We had a coup d'etat in February 23rd of 1981 that was actually filmed in television and then broadcasted the next day. And it was King Juan Carlos who came in TV after a few hours and said that he didn't support it. And with that, most of the army fell behind him and the coup was averted. And then in 1982, the Socialist Party won the elections with absolute majority, and he would win several elections throughout. Since 1975 until now, the Socialist Party has been in power 25 years in Spain. It currently is the party in power. The 1980s, with the Socialist Party in power, were again a time of upheaval with a lot of industrial reconversion, terrorism from the right, paramilitary terrorism of GAL against ETA. You also had Spain starting to integrate into the rest of the world. They came into the European Union and the NATO, and the economy rebounded. But again, people in the street protesting the industrial reconversion. We had been raised voiceless, but now anything that happened, we were on the street protesting. And 1992 is the year where Spain finally has arrived. Barcelona holds the Olympic Games, presents itself to the rest of the world as a thoroughly modern city. Madrid is the capital of culture, and Seville has the Universal Exhibition, all in the same year. So it was like the final culmination of a decade-long effort from the Socialist Party to show that Spain was a modern, fully modern, liberal country, and they did pull it off. Now, after 1992, we entered a huge recession, but for the moment, we were at the top, and it was thrilling. I forgot to mention, but just to give you an example, that's another strike. I just wanted to show you. We were always protesting. That Kobe, the mascot of the 1992 Olympic Games, you know what that means? That Kobe, why is that weird, that dog? It was supposed to be a cubist dog. And again, every aspect of the Olympic Games was thought out so that we would look modern, right? So that was designed by Javier Mariscal, who was a very modern designer. And he kind of made it, it's a Catalan sheepdog, but made in cubist, kind of cubist. I don't know if I can call it cubist, but modern, in a modern way. And that's it. This is my memoir, Promenade of Desire, a Barcelona memoir, where I talk about this journey that I mentioned, and it has a lot of historical context, and it's a fun read from what I hear. And now, if you have any questions, I'm here, very happy to try and answer them. Oh my God, I took almost the whole hour. Go ahead.
Check.
Sorry, I went a little long, Susan. I got excited.
Other than the students' rebellion or disenchantment, was the amnesty law broadly supported? I mean, what was the country's reaction to the people who had tortured being given no accountability?
Very good question. It was supported by all the establishment and all the political parties as a way to move forward. It was not supported by a lot of people, lay people in Spain. We did have a lot of protests about that as well. But in fact, I mean, right now, I think it's been 2000, I want to say it's 2017, they passed another law. It's called the Law of Historical Memory that doesn't, it doesn't make the amnesty law illegal or anything. It still exists. But this law of historical memory allows for the recognition of people that were affected by crime either during the Franco regime or during the Civil War, meaning both sides. Also for like people who were nationalists who were executed or tortured or whatever by the Republicans during the war or so on. But no, it was definitely not widely supported by all the population, but by all the political parties, by all the establishment, yes, because it was kind of the condition to move into democracy. Yes.
Very good talk, by the way.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask a question. I wanted to ask a question about the non-glory days of our unbeloved leader who finally kicked the bucket in 1975. And let me tell you, I was happy. And I'm not even Spanish. But I wanted to find out about in the years where Franco had his clutches on the country so tightly, what about the poor, lonely Protestants and other secret freethinkers? Did they have to kind of start their own underground schools, or did they have to shut up and go to the parochial schools, the Catholic schools, for their education?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I can really answer that with good knowledge, so I'm not daring to give an answer. I know that probably they would continue to do their own things in private in terms of serving their religion. But I don't think there were Protestant or Jewish schools, but I cannot completely assure you. I don't want to say something that I don't know for sure about, so you have to forgive me. I'll look it up, though. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm interested in the psychological implications of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And I was in Spain in 1972 or 73, and I remember speaking with a taxi driver and asking him what he thought about the Franco regime. And his answer was that Spaniards are so uncontrollable that they required a heavy hand. And that struck me as a way to sort of justify, to look at that kind of regime as, in fact, suggesting that the members of this society were so powerful and so energetic and so virile, really, that this was an advantage, or this was a way to indicate underscore their power. And I'm wondering if you have a comment on that, and if that's a way to subvert, a subversive way to encourage support for that kind of regime.
I love that comment. I think a lot of people think that way, and I think sometimes we cannot see things as black and white. There's always a lot of gray, right? So for example, there's a lot of people that say, well, the only reason that Spain is where it is today is because Franco was a strong man and he had stability in the country and blah, 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 blah. I mean, it's true that if you think about what happened before Franco, were 25 coup d'etat in 100 years, I mean, who can do anything in a country that is constantly in that upheaval, right? So it's true that it provided a certain stability that allowed, especially in the 60s, to develop industry and so on. However, that is not an excuse for completely curtailing freedom, and which is what he did, right? And I think that, in a way, if you look at the photos that I had here of demonstrations, you realize that, yes, once the Spaniards were not under the thumb of Francoism and knowing that they could be taken to jail for participating in a demonstration, tortured or executed or whatever, they are in the streets for everything. I mean, Spain's demonstrations are massive all the time. So we are a very strong population, very expressive. That's something that is funny because here when September 11 happened, people were terrified. and they closed themselves at home. I remember people were not crossing the bridge because they were scared that there would be a terrorist attack in the bridge and everybody would die. For a while, it's like the streets were much more empty. In Spain, you had a terrorist attack in the station of Atocha in Madrid. The next day, you had hundreds of thousands of people in the street protesting. It's just a very expressive, passionate population. However, I don't agree with that taxi driver opinion. I think that the reason that that wasn't happening more, because it was happening, as you saw with the students that were reuniting inside the church, but the reason that it didn't happen more is that the consequences were immediate and they were violent. They really jailed you. I mean, it was dangerous. You couldn't really do it without risking your freedom or even your life. So that's my opinion. Oh, this lady was here first, actually.
I'm 11 years older than you, from Detroit, but the way you were raised, that was my life here in the United States. So I'm wondering, all my teachers were Sister Mary so-and-so. Most of my classmates were Mary something. My name had to be changed because we had to be named after saints, so my middle name is Jean. Mm-hmm. And then I couldn't get a credit card after I was married without my husband. But most of the stuff, that's the same as from being raised Catholic. So what I want to know is, after Franco, does Spain still give money to the Catholic Church?
It's not anymore a Catholic country. So there's some grants and so on, but not the way it was before, which was completely paid off by the state. That's a very good point you make. I think that what happened in Spain happened in other countries as well. It's just that in Spain it lasted very long. I mean, that marital permit lasted until 1975. So that's but we in every country, we've changed a lot in the 20th century, for sure, yeah.
Let's finish up with one more.
Hi, thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
So I want to take you back to the Civil War when the U.S. and Western powers did not support the Republicans, and while the fascist Germans and Italians were pouring in aid to the Francos. And do you think, had aid been supplied at that time, could it have changed the course of the Civil War? And the second part of that is, how do you feel about us providing that aid now to Ukraine, where there's also a fight for democracy against fascism?
Wow. Okay. Well, for the first part of your question, I think it definitely could have changed the course of the war. I mean, for sure, if we had had more support on the Republican side. But I have to say, the Republican side, a big issue they had, it was very disjointed. There were many parties in the Republican side, and they were all fighting each other, the communists and the anarchists and the socialists and the whatever. They didn't have any unity. So even with help, I'm not sure they would have pulled it off because of this the nationalist side was very united, the other side was very in turmoil. So it was kind of hard to manage. In terms of Ukraine, I'd rather not answer that question because it goes beyond the scope of the presentation, but I'm happy to talk to you after the presentation if you want. But it's just, I feel like it's not part of the topic today, sorry.
Well, we will, thank you, Isidra. I think this was very much like a class, all right? It's wonderful to have this kind of background and then be able, I have not quite finished myself your book, but I highly recommend it to people. I want to say that in 3 weeks' time, Ali will be back here. You'll be joined by Professor Darren Zook in politics, who's going to give us, speaking of democracy, all of an opportunity to be able to talk about the midterms and where we go following that election. The kinds of conversations that Ali's been trying to focus on during this fall term. Let's talk as best as we can across aisles, across red and blue, across family lines. And I do want to mention the person who last asked a question about Ukraine is Dr. Michael Baker, who's just returned the second time in going to Ukraine to help with medical aid. And Michael, do we want to take one more minute? Michael, do you want to talk about your course or anything?
I'm really not a historian by trade or by training, but I try to look at American history dispassionately and critically and look at the things we could have fixed. So the course I'm planning for the winter term is to take a look at how America became great, and I couldn't say the other half, so I said the other half is how can we regain that prominence in world affairs.
Nice.
All right, everybody. Isidra, thank you, and everybody else, thank you for being here. And hope we'll see you in the next 3 weeks. Bring a friend.